Today, we're going to dive into a philosophical revolution, one that completely flipped our understanding of language on its head. It's the story of how we went from searching for some perfect, logical way to speak to, well, appreciating the powerful, kind of messy way we all talk every single day. And it all started with a pretty wild idea.
I mean, that sounds crazy, right? To just dismiss some of our deepest beliefs, our most fundamental moral statements as just noise? Gibberish with no actual meaning? Well, what if I told you that a massively influential movement in philosophy did exactly that? Yep, let me introduce you to the logical positivists. Think of them as the ambitious cleanup crew of philosophy. They looked around, saw all this confusing, abstract talk, and decided they wanted to make philosophy as clean, as rigorous, and as clear as science. And to do that, they came up with one very, very strict rule. So the positivists basically became the meaning police. Their whole mission was to get rid of what they saw as fuzzy, unprovable nonsense that had bogged down philosophy for centuries. And their weapon of choice for this mission? A single, devastatingly simple test. And this was it, their golden rule, the verifiability criterion. The idea was simple. If you can't, at least in theory, check if a statement is true using your senses, by seeing it, hearing it, touching it, then it's not actually a statement about a fact. It's just an emotion. It's like shouting hooray or ouch. It doesn't really mean anything about the world. Now, you can probably see where this is going. This one rule just sliced human thought right in two. On one side, you had the good stuff, science, logic, anything with verifiable facts. But everything else? Ethics, theology, metaphysics, even poetry. All of it got tossed into the meaningless pile. A statement like God exists? Can't see or touch God, so meaningless noise. Murder is wrong. Well, you can see the murder, but you can't empirically verify the wrongness, so also meaningless. You can imagine this didn't go over too well with a lot of people. So naturally, people started to push back. And what's so cool is that the biggest challenge didn't come from some dense, complicated, logical proof. It came from stories. In a now famous BBC discussion, 3 philosophers used simple parables, little stories, to ask a big question. Does this super narrow definition of meaning actually make any sense in the real world? First up to the plate was Anthony Flew. And what's interesting is that he wasn't really trying to defend religion. He was using it to poke holes in the positivists' logic, especially their idea of falsification. The rule that for something to be meaningful, you have to be able to imagine some evidence that could prove it wrong. So here's the story. 2 explorers stumble upon this perfect little garden in the middle of a dense jungle. One of them says, "Wow, there must be a gardener who comes and tends this plot." But the other is a skeptic. So they set up camp, they watch. Nothing. They put up an electric fence, get some bloodhounds. Still nothing. No gardener is ever detected. But the believer isn't shaken. He just says, you see, there is a gardener, but he's invisible, intangible, and makes no sound. Flew's question was brilliant. If your belief just keeps changing to dodge any evidence against it, does it really mean anything at all? It's a great challenge, but it also shows that people do hold these kinds of beliefs and they matter deeply to them. Okay, next up was R.M. Hare. He took a slightly different angle. He wanted to zoom in on how these unfalsifiable beliefs, even if they aren't scientific facts, can literally shape a person's entire reality. His story isn't about a garden, but a paranoid university professor. This professor is 100% convinced that all of his colleagues are secretly plotting to kill him. His friends try to help. They introduce him to the nicest, kindest professors on campus. And what does he say? See? That's how cunning they are. They're just acting nice to lower my guard. Absolutely no evidence can change his mind. Hart called this core conviction oblique. It's not a factual claim, you can't prove it right or wrong, but it's the lens through which he sees the entire world. So to call it meaningless just seems wrong. It's the most meaningful thing there is to him. And that brings us to our third and final story, from Basil Mitchell. This one adds 2 really important ingredients to the mix: trust and hope. Picture this. It's wartime, and you're part of the resistance. One day, a mysterious stranger finds you. He makes a powerful impression and tells you, "I'm secretly on your side, trust me." And you do. But then, things get complicated. You see him in the enemy's uniform. You even see him handing over some of your fellow fighters. What do? Mitchell says the believer doesn't just ignore this stuff. It's painful. It creates doubt. But they hold on to that initial trust, thinking he must have his reasons. There's a bigger picture I can't see yet. Their belief isn't just a blind assertion. It's a commitment, a personal trust they hold on to, waiting for everything to make sense in the end. So you see what's happening here, right? These 3 stories, together, paint a much richer picture of language. They show that we use words for way more than just stating facts we can check. We use them to express our deepest convictions, to make life-altering commitments, to hold on to trust. The positivist's strict scientific ruler was just too small to measure the full scope of human expression. So, all this pushback needed some real philosophical muscle behind it. And that firepower came, mostly, from one brilliant and eccentric thinker, Ludwig Wittgenstein. In his later work, he totally blew up the idea that language has only one real job. This is honestly one of my favorite analogies in all of philosophy. Wittgenstein told us to stop thinking about language as a perfect picture of reality and to start thinking of it like a toolbox. Words are tools, right? You'd never ask if a hammer is more true than a screwdriver. That question doesn't even make sense. They just do different jobs. And for Wittgenstein, words are exactly the same. I mean, just think about all the different stuff we do with words. We describe things, sure, but we also give orders, we tell jokes, we ask questions, we pray, we thank people, we curse when we stub a toe. Wittgenstein called these different jobs language games. Each game has its own set of rules, and the huge mistake the positivists made was thinking that only one game, the science game, was the real one. Now, this new way of thinking wasn't just some abstract theory. It actually started to solve, or maybe dissolve, some of the oldest, most stubborn problems in philosophy. And a philosopher named Gilbert Ryle used it to take on the big one, the mind-body problem. Ryle's big idea was something he called a category mistake. It's when you talk about something as if it belongs to one category when it actually belongs to another. Imagine giving a tour of a university. You show someone the library, the labs, the lecture halls, the students, and at the end they say, "Okay, this is all great, but where is the university?" They're making a category mistake. The university isn't another building alongside the others. It's the whole system working together. It's in a different category. And here is the genius move. Ryle said that philosophers for centuries had been making a giant category mistake. They talked about the mind as if it were some kind of spooky, invisible thing, a ghost, that lives inside the physical machine of the body. He argued this entire famous problem was just a confusion, a myth we created by using our language in a clumsy way. The ghost in the machine. Okay, so words are tools, and we play different games with them. But it gets even cooler. Another philosopher, J.L. Austin, realized that when we speak, we are not just talking. We are actively doing things. Speaking is an action. Austin broke it down into 3 levels. First, there's the locutionary act. That's just the physical act of making sounds and forming words. But then there's the illocutionary act. That's what you are doing in saying the words. When a judge says, "I sentence you to 10 years in prison," she's not just describing something. She is performing the act of sentencing. And finally, there's the perlocutionary act, the effect you have on the listener. You might persuade them or scare them or inspire them. Language isn't just about truth or falsity, it's about getting things done. So let's pull all these threads together. What's the big picture takeaway here? Well, what we've seen is a huge fundamental shift. Philosophy moved away from this dream of a perfect, restrictive language and towards a much richer, more realistic, more human understanding of how we actually talk. So on one hand, you had the positivist dream of language as a perfect, precise measuring stick, designed to purify and restrict what we could say. On the other hand, we have the messy reality. Language is a powerful, flexible human toolbox. It has countless jobs, countless games. And the goal isn't to restrict it, but to understand and appreciate all the amazing things it lets us do. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. The next time you talk to someone, when you promise a friend you'll be there, when you tell a joke to make someone laugh, when you argue about something you care about, you're not just moving air and stating facts. You're using the tools in your toolbox. You're performing actions, building your world, and connecting with others. So the real question is, what games are you playing with your words every single day?